You can do everything but disagree. Okay, so the title of this class is in honor of the upcoming Yom HaAtzmaut. And tonight already in Israel, I've seen the pictures of the Yom HaZikaron, where the fallen of Israel are being commemorated and remembered and honored. And sundown tomorrow, Wednesday evening, will commence the celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut, which is celebrating the 74th Independence Day of Israel, which is an amazing, amazing milestone. I have to say that my entire life, there has been a country, Israel, in the world, and I'm very thankful for that. I don't know if everybody on the call could say that, but in any event, it certainly has made a vast difference in my life. And I want to just share a personal sentiment. I mean, my earliest memory of Israel, because I don't think I remember us talking about it at home much when I was a little kid, at least not that I can remember. But I was in first grade at the Hebrew Academy of Washington. And this would have been 1956 or 7. And our teacher was an Israeli. And in Washington, D.C., there were not Israelis that I knew of other than the ambassadorial team that was, that was downtown. And interesting enough, she devoted herself. She left Israel not long after independence, and she came to Washington to teach Jewish children. And so it was learning Hebrew with an Israeli accent, which was completely rare in those days. And it was having a teacher who just brought a certain feeling to our classroom at the Hebrew Academy. But the real impression to me was one day, as we were working our way through the school year, she came in and she set up a little movie camera, reel-to-reel movie camera. And she set up a little screen and she darkened the room. And I have a direct memory of. She showed us a picture of people dancing in the streets of Tel Aviv in a circle and celebrating. And as she was explaining to us very simply what was taking place, there were tears running down her eyes. And she was amazingly charged and emotional to an extent that all these years later, I remember it. And I went home that day and I said, hey, today is a really special day. Today, Israel became free. That's the way I understood it in first grade. And I can tell you, Yom HaAtzmaut was not widely celebrated in the United States at that point. And that really is my introduction to Israel. It happened on Yom HaAtzmaut, and I feel tremendously grateful. And at the age of 17, I left home to study for a year in Israel in the yeshiva, which was a life-changing year for me. And thankfully, my family, all my kids have studied in Israel. We've been to Israel many, many, many times. And certainly Yom HaAtzmaut is an incredibly special day celebrated at the Hebrew Day School, and not just celebrated, but really evocatively impacting all of us. So I wanted to do something interesting in terms of Yom HaAtzmaut. What I wanted to do was I wanted to join a Bible discussion that took place, as far as I can tell, in 1977. Not long after Yom HaAtzmaut, we're celebrating 74 years of Israel's independence this year, and this would have been before Israel had turned 30. And for those of us familiar, the year 1977 is a remarkable, remarkable year, because that's when Menachem Begin was elected prime minister. And this is not a political statement, but from the founding of the state, every single government was the same, was a labor government. And then shockingly, in the elections of 1977, in May of 1977, Menachem Begin was elected prime minister. He assumed office in June. And what I want to go through together with you is a beautiful chapter 33 in this book, The Prime Ministers. It's a beautiful book written by Yehuda Avner, who served many of the prime ministers of Israel as their assistant. And he describes here, and I looked up the dates. I believe this gathering took place on Saturday evening, July 2nd, 1977, in the prime minister's residence in Israel. And if you have this book or access to this book, The Prime Ministers, it's chapter 33. I really suggest it's a beautiful moment to revisit this. Now, Menachem Begin was not an observant Orthodox Jew, but he was the first prime minister who was much more, I would say, traditional. One of his first rulings was that there should be only kosher food in all of the embassies, and that Israel should adhere to certain traditions, even though he was not observant himself. But he had a sense of the Jewish people in a very special way. So here, literally 1 week after he becomes prime minister, and not long before he was to travel to America for the first time and meet the United States president, he gathered a group of people in the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem, what's called the Bible Circle. And what they would do is they would get together every Shabbat evening, afternoon, just as the sun was going down, right around this time of the day. And they had a discussion, a Torah discussion. It happens to be that, and again, this was not on HaAtzmaut, this was on the summertime, July 2nd, 1977, and it's recorded here. The weekly Torah reading that week was Balak, and including in the section of Balak, very famously, is the non-Jewish prophet Bilam, who was hired to curse the Jewish people, and who instead gave prophecies from different vantage points overlooking the Jewish people in the wilderness. And those prophecies were, in fact, blessings, deemed as blessings to the Jewish people. And I'm not going to read this to you, but I'm going to go through an outline of it. So Menachem Begin gathered, he says, approximately 20 scholars and people, Bible students. It's not a political group. And he gathered them together in the residency, and he opened up his copy of the Torah to this section. You can find it in the Stone Chumash if you have one there on page 865. And he began reading chapter 23 and discussing it to them. And then he stopped on sentence number 9, which is a very famous sentence. And I'll read it to you, first in Hebrew, then in English. Ki merosh tsurim arena umigvaot ashurena. I'm looking down at them from the mountaintops. I'm gazing on them from both the heights. And if you just think about it, you can really do the geography. The Jewish people were in the 40th year after going out of Egypt. They were about to enter the land of Israel. And they were across the Jordan River, and there were mountains all around them, and they were in a valley. So Bilam in chapter 23, Numbers chapter 23, 9 has this vision, and he says he's gazing down upon the Jewish people, and we can imagine all the Jewish people gathered in their tents. Very famously, at a different prophecy, he said, Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, how goodly are your tents. But this time he has a different message. He says, Hein levadod yishkon, uvagoyim lo yitchashav. And we're going to look at the translation of this, but the normal translation is there is a people that dwells apart, dwells alone, not reckoned among the nations. So his vision of us, the Jewish people, and this was physically true at the time, we were apart, living in an uninhabited area, gathered together. And in a certain sense, he gave us a blessing, a curse. It's really hard to tell with him. You'll be a people that dwells alone. You will not be reckoned amongst the nations. Now, just after this, the king who hired him, Bilam, criticized him. Why didn't you curse them? Why did you bless them? And he says, look, this is what God, these are the words God put into our mouths. So Menachem Begin, the newly elected prime minister of Israel in 1977, was sitting on a couch in a quiet room with a group of 20 other people. He remarked, he said, isn't this an amazing prophetic vision of the Jewish people? And look how true it has proven to be throughout our history, that we have dwelled alone, and that we have never been reckoned amongst the nations of the world. So we're gonna think about we're gonna look at the discussion that provoked. But it's an interesting thing that when someone is the leader of a nation state, a member of the United Nations, an elected representative of a democracy, to resonate so deeply with the loneliness of the Jewish people. And here Yehuda Avner, who's present and wrote this chapter later about the meeting, said he remembered going to the United Nations earlier with Golda Meir. And Golda Meir was always structured. Her big comment was, here we are, all the nations of the world, and I see we, the Jewish people, we Israel, we have no family here. Those were the words she used. We have no family here. We're alone. And Menachem Begin goes on and he says to himself, isn't it interesting? We are part of Asia. The Asian countries want to have nothing to do with us. We live amongst Arab countries. They not only want to have nothing to do with us, they're antagonistic to us. We sit in the United Nations with absolutely no, not possibly part of any bloc. He says there's numerous Christian nations, there's numerous Muslim nations. There are nations that are affiliated by region, by religion, by language. He says, no matter how you slice it and dice it, isn't it amazing that Israel remains totally a singular, unique nation without meaningful affiliation or brotherly connection with any other nation on earth? And this is what he reads from the text of the Torah. This is what Bilam was evoking when he looked out over the Jewish people, and this was his prophetic vision. And of course, this typical Jewish fashion, everyone begins to make comments and discuss what's going on that evening. And the first person to speak is a gentleman named Orbach, who I am not familiar with. He's a Bible scholar, and he riffs on the idea that the word yitchashev, that we are reckoned, we are not reckoned amongst the Jewish people, has a hint that we choose not to be reckoned amongst the Jewish people. To which Nechama Leibowitz, the Bible scholar from Hebrew University, and a woman who I had the privilege of studying with once in Israel, passed away, but at that moment in 1977, she pointed out the grammar of the sentence. And for those people who know Hebrew, yitchashev is reflexive, and it almost hints at the notion that we, the Jewish people, we don't reckon ourselves to be amongst the nations of the world. And that, as the discussion continued, the more old line Zionists in the room raised the issue that, the whole origin of Zionism, which was aimed at blunting anti-Semitism and ending what had been an exile of 2,000 years of almost unending persecution and strangeness, especially for the European Jews of the world. He says, isn't it interesting that the early Zionist motto was, let's become a nation state, and as soon as we have our own land and our own state, and we have a government, anti-Semitism will immediately stop. Because we'll be another country, as one of the early Zionists said in one of the conferences, people don't hate Uruguay. People don't hate countries of the world out of the blue. People seemed, for the last 1900 years, to have almost unending ridicule for us, the Jewish people. But when we actualize our dream of coming to the land of Israel, creating a country of our own, fashioning a government, taking a seat at the United Nations, taking our place, our rightful place amongst the nations of the world, all of that will dissipate. And even one Zionist said, at a later time in the 20s, says, I can only imagine when we have an airline with an Israeli flag on it, how much that will raise the estimation of the Gentile world for the Jew. And yet sitting there in 1977, when Israel really, I mean, to say Israel is in crisis is, you don't even have to say that, because you can throw a dart in the wall and no matter what year you're talking about, people would say it's in crisis. But as people know 1977, part of what brought Menachem Begin to office and what disrupted what had been an orderly 19 years of labor rule of the country was a sense of hopelessness in Israel. They felt that they had suffered tremendous losses in the Yom Kippur War. They had felt that they were unprepared for it. They felt tremendous vulnerability to the Arab nations around them. There was talk about Arab nations acquiring nuclear weapons and all that might unfold. So it was a time of uncertainty in the minds of the Jewish people. So these people thinking back and saying, they're wondering as a group, and you have to read it, I'm not capturing it exactly right, I don't think, but they were wondering what happened to our Zionist aspirations, that as soon as we could declare our independence in what was then called Palestine, and the word Israel would go on the map of the world, and we would have an ambassador at the United Nations, and we would have embassies, and we would have an airline with an Israeli flag on it. Wouldn't that put an end to our outcast status in the world? And here, how many years, 29 years after the Freedom Declaration of the State, all these people were wondering, why didn't that happen? What's the real meaning of this prophecy? Where has it taken us? What is the real solution to the problem? And then he describes how, and this person he just calls Sruluk, and Sruluk is the wild-haired, archaeologically based Zionist, and he quotes from the Torah profoundly, and he says, maybe the mistake we have been making is wanting to be a nation like all the nations of the world. And that's a phrase in Hebrew. We wanted to be a goy kechol hagoyim. We wanted to be a nation amongst nations. He said, and maybe that premise itself wasn't a good premise. And after all, maybe it really was Bilam who himself, after all, was a master anti-Semite. He was hired to curse us, the Jewish people, even before we made it to the land for the very first time, in order to daunt our aspirations and in order to blunt the future possibility of there ever to still birth the Jewish people even before it ever existed. So perhaps he was a genius in instilling this sense into the world that the Jewish people, no matter how much they aspire to be a nation amongst the nations, would never, as to use the Zionist phrase, normalize. This idea that when we achieve self-determination, we will be normalized amongst the nations of the world and there would be no anti-Semitism. This Sruluk was theorizing that maybe it was really these words that were spoken by Bilam against the Jewish people all those thousands of years before. Maybe that's what really pulled the carpet out from under us. And then Menachem Begin himself takes charge of the discussion, getting a little heated. People were offended that anyone would say such things about Zionism. And so Menachem Begin himself, he reads a section from a book written by a man that he personally admired, Dr. Yaakov Herzog, a man who was the chief rabbi of England and who was a noted figure in Israel in its early days. And he wrote a treatise called A People That Dwells Alone. So Yaakov Herzog wrote an entire book on this. And he writes, the theory of classic Zionism was national normalization. What was wrong with the theory? It was based on the idea that a people that dwells alone itself is an abnormal concept, but actually, a people dwelling alone is a natural concept of the Jewish people. And he concludes this section by saying something very provocative. One must invoke the phrase, a people that dwells alone, not to understand how the Jews have existed for so long. One must invoke it as a testimony to the Jewish right to exist at all in the land of their rebirth. What an amazing thought that we, the Jewish people, Rabbi Herzog is pointing out, have always, and as this group was considering, must always for the future, muster the determination and live with the realization that it's our willingness to be a lonely people upholding a unique faith and living out a unique historical reality. That's why we are around today. And that's why we even merited the miracles of 1948 and thereafter and before, which has enabled us to have a state of our own. And then Begin is quoted here as concluding it, there you have it. Cease dwelling alone, and we cease to exist. What a conundrum. Now, that ends this chapter. And I think it's a privilege that Yehuda Avner gave us the privilege of literally joining Menachem Begin and this vanguard of Jewish thinkers, putting us around the table, so to speak, in 1977, and placing before us ideas that if we stop for a moment, we understand in 2022, how much more true are these realities? How much more blatant is it that the Jewish people, that Israel is a nation that dwells alone? And as has been said a million times, is there any other nation on earth where its legitimacy as a nation, its right to exist, its place in the world is called into question the way Israel's is called into question? There's no comparison to anything. So here we are, we want to celebrate Israel. Believe me, every bone of my body feels the sacrifice that was made. I had the uncomfortable experience just a few weeks ago of writing a letter to a family that had children in the Hebrew day school because their son succumbed to his injuries as an IDF soldier. Family was Israeli. They came to San Diego for a few years. They moved back to Israel. This young man who was not in our school because he wasn't born at that time in the family's life. But when I read about him passing away, I wrote them a letter. These are the sacrifices that it has taken from the dawn of the return to Zion, the modern return, through today. And we all know, unfortunately, how it continues on into the future. These are the sacrifices that are required of us. But I think there's also an attitude that we can come to. And that fellow Srulik, who's not identified by his last name, and I have no idea who he was, when he said that the cardinal mistake was to be a goy kechol hagoyim, and please understand the word goy is not a pejorative in a biblical sense. We're called a goy, we're a nation. It's the term for a distinct nation. So it's not the pejorative of goyim that was used in the Yiddish language. Goy is a nation. When Rebecca seeks out to understand why her pregnancy is difficult, she's given the prophetic vision, Shnei goyim bevitnech, that within your womb, there are two nations. There's the nation of Esav, which is going to head toward world domination, and there's the nation of Jacob, us, the Jewish people, that is going to be the tent dwellers of the world, whose aspiration is peace and harmony and being a light unto the nations that illuminates the world in a way that doesn't afford conquest, but affords upliftment and sensitivity. And I would just point out, just when Srulik made that comment, and I read it here, if you look in the book of Samuel 1, chapter 8, sentence 4, it's a very critical moment where the Jewish people come to Samuel the prophet, an amazingly great man. And they say to him, Samuel, we need a king. We're not happy with you as a prophet. And the words that the Jewish people use there is, they say to Samuel, and I'm reading here, I only have it in Hebrew, chapter 8, sentence 5. Hinei ato zakanta, you're already old. Uvanecha lo halcho b'drachecha, and your children aren't going to succeed you. Sima lanu melech, place a king on us, kechol hagoyim. And what the Torah, like all the nations of the world, what the prophet is highlighting here is that there's always been that yearning. Why can't we just be like everybody else? Why can't we, Fiddler on the Roof? I know we're the chosen people, God, but once in a while, maybe you could choose someone else. That was the humorous comment that Tevye makes in a prayerful moment in the middle of the story of Fiddler on the Roof. So there was a sense amongst the Jewish people that a lot's expected of us. We're vulnerable. The Torah says, right from the get-go, I'm going to take you from the land of Egypt, which has a natural source of water, 24/7, 365 days a year, the Nile flows. And if you want to grow something, you just tap into it. And instead, I'm going to bring you to a land of vulnerability, a land where sometimes it rains, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it rains too hard. So you're going to be dependent on a continuing relationship with God in order to be successful in the land. Unlike the Egyptians, who can live a godless life because they've got their source of water, they just have to tap into it. So the whole sense of Judaism right from the beginning, right from Abraham making his choice that he wants to align himself with God throughout history, and God says, okay, then you're gonna have to travel, you're gonna have to leave, you're gonna have to go to a land that I will show you. And again, it's not a land filled with oil wells that you just tap into the ground and you have billionaires. It's a land that God's eyes are upon the land, and you can flourish in that land in a unique fashion. It's a land that ultimately we've seen with our own two eyes. It only supports the Jewish people, because for 1900 years when we were not there, the land was fallow. In 1967, when they wanted to remember where the dividing line was between the original Israel of 1948 and the quote unquote conquered West Bank, they called it the Green Line. How did they establish the Green Line? The UN people got in helicopters and they flew along the border, and on the left it was green because that was where the Israelis lived, and on the right it was brown because that's where the other peoples were living. So they called it the Green Line. They said, we don't even need surveyors. We can just draw it on a map because it's as clear as day. One part is flourishing, one part isn't. And the Torah itself talks about that. This is a land that will yield only to us, but it yields only to us when we're ready to consider ourselves as a unique people in the world. And that's, as Menachem Begin said, that's our conundrum. And that's what gives us such an amazing chance to celebrate. And I want to put to the lie an idea that you see quoted historically all the time, and very often by Jewish thinkers in the current times. When Jewish thinkers approach assimilation and why assimilation is so rampant today, what you'll typically hear historians of Jewish history say is, well, we need anti-Semitism to put us in a ghetto, and then we remain Jews. But when the ghetto walls come down and I get my chance to get a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and or whatever else, whatever other great entree to society that lures me, and I'm willing to put my Judaism aside and out of the picture, that's when assimilation takes place. And I dare say that the key phrase is Am levadod yishkon ubagayim lo yid chashav. The challenge for us is to cherish Israel, to celebrate our independence, to celebrate we have a homeland that is a nation amongst the nations, unique, differentiated, and we consider ourselves unique, and we're ready to step up to the plate and maintain that uniqueness and struggle with all of our moral might to remain a light unto the nations. We have to struggle with all of our physical might in order to withstand the constant assaults and physical attacks against us. And thankfully, with courage and conviction, we see that Israelis and have mustered the courage and the wherewithal to stand tall. And we need to likewise muster the conviction to stand tall. And I'll just, and so it's not a question that we need anti-Semitism to keep us Jewish. We need to keep alive within us the pride and the honor of feeling that we're Jewish in order to stand in our own right amongst the nations of the world and to have our unique place within it. The Netziv, Rabbi Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin until it closed in 1898, he looked at this sentence in a very unique way. And I have his commentary in front of me. I just want to make note of it. It says, there is a people that dwells apart, not reckoned amongst the nations. And he adds a nuance which he derives from Talmudic sources. He says, these two phrases have to be separated. Am levadod yishkon. We remain a nation so long as we recognize our uniqueness. Ubagayim lo yitchashav. But if we abandon our uniqueness and our goal becomes to be a nation like any other nation, then we lose our reckoning and we dissolve and disappear, just the way Menachem Begin mentioned it. So when I think of celebrating HaAtzmaut tomorrow night, and as we in the Hebrew Day School spend an entire day on Thursday, taking our kids through Jewish history, celebrating, as a preschool parent stopped me yesterday with a smile on his face. And he said, you know, my child has been living in Israel the last 2 weeks. I said, what do you mean? He said, because when he comes to school, they give him a little backpack and they give him a little sun hat to put on. And as far as he is concerned, he's walking through Israel day by day, standing at the representation of the Kotel, going through sand in the Negev, climbing a hill which represents them, the Galil in the north of Israel. And he said, in the mind and heart of my 3-year-old son, he's not living in San Diego in preparation for Thursday's celebration of HaAtzmaut. He's already living there. This idea is what we need to celebrate, what we should celebrate together, because it not only places within us tremendous pride and purpose in having the land of Israel and remaining as the Jewish people in the land of Israel, it also protects our future and gives us the opportunity to say, Am levadod yishkon. We're going to remain a nation, unique, differentiated, proud of who we are, with no apologies, and will recognize the fact that there is tension in being a light unto the nations. But it's a privilege, it's an opportunity, and having us, the Jewish people, filling up the land of Israel in the way that we are, gives us an even greater opportunity to magnify our impact on the world in a good way, to stand tall, and ultimately to elevate all the nations of the world through our own example. And on that basis, I want to wish us all HaAtzmaut Sameach. We should celebrate together. We should revel together. We should inspire our children together, just like Morabatcha, when I was 6 years old, set up that little reel-to-reel projector, showed us those vague pictures of people dancing in a circle in the street that I couldn't even imagine where that was happening, and thinking to myself as a little boy, who dances in the street anyway? But it was the tears coming down her face. It was her pride. I understand now, I don't know enough about her life, that she was a fighter in Eitzel, in Menachem Begin's units leading up to the War of Independence, and that she really had sacrificed. She saw a dream come true, and then she came to Washington, D.C. to inspire us little American kids so that we would learn this lesson, we would stand up to this example, and we would perpetuate Judaism and the Jewish people throughout history. HaAtzmaut Sameach. If anyone has a question, I'm happy to answer it. So when I can't hear you, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you very, very much for being here. And if I can I unmute you?
Okay, I got it.
Okay.
Your story just reminds me of the image that Fanny Krasner tells us about when she worked at, after her Holocaust experiences at the World Congress in Stockholm for lobbying the United Nations in 47 for their resolution, and then in May of 48, after working with everyone from all the aspects of Israeli founders for that interim year, when they declared the state of Israel, how they all went into the streets of Stockholm and were dancing in the street in front of the offices of the Jewish World Congress. And, you know, it evokes the same sort of commitment of people who had, you know, really worked to thinking that this was a means for protecting Jews around the world. You know, she always ends her speech by saying that when she was in, as she says, in those dark days, that we looked to the left for help and there was no one. We looked to the right for assistance and no one cared. And today we don't have to look to the left or the right because we have Israel behind us.
Right. And you know, it's not a simple pill either, because you know there's if you look at this book of prime ministers, and again I just want to use it as a contrast here, not a criticism, God forbid, but Golda Meir, after the losses of this Yom Kippur War, as she was in her waning months of being prime minister, the big thing was that Soviet Jews were becoming free. They were being liberated and they were being sent. And the Chancellor of Austria, who was a Jewish man, was preventing them from going to Israel. And hence many of them had to come to the United States. And Golda Meir was so incensed, she got on a special plane. She was flown to meet him. It's described in his book, Prime Minister. She went into his office. And here's what she said. It's a profound moment in contrast to this. I don't remember his name right now. I could look it up. But she said to him, "My brother in arms, my comrade, we're fellow socialists. We have spent our lives working on behalf of socialist causes. How could you prevent these newly liberated people from coming to their homeland?" And he looked at her with a sense that I have no commonality with your Jewish. He was Jewish by birth, but he said he had zero feeling for letting Jewish people go to the land of Israel. And she wrote herself, she was totally dismayed. And if you think about it, that was like a phrase that was used in psychology in the 60s and 70s. It was a myth exploding, that there could be a brotherhood based on socialism that would endure and that would be protective of Jewish people. That there could be a brotherhood because I'm a prime minister and you're a prime minister. There's this sense of aloneness that, and I don't mean aloneness in the sense that we're not seeking brotherhood with others, but with a sense that ultimately we understand that it is our uniqueness that we derive our strength, that we derive our conviction from, and that carries us forward. And there can't be any substitute for that. And that's the bitter lesson going all the way back to the time of Samuel, when the Jewish people imagine, if you give me a tall, strong, fearless king like all the nations around us, then life will go better for us. You see, and what God ultimately responds, I didn't go through all the sentences there in 1 Samuel chapter 8. God says to Samuel, don't feel badly. It's not you they're rejecting. It's not your leadership. It's me. It's God's leadership. You see, and that's the idea that when Menachem Begin said, we became a nation and a religion at the same time. And there are so many other nations that share their religion, share their language, but because we got them both together, they're just locked up in a way that we need to affirm both at the same time. We need to be proud Jews, and we need to stand up for Israel, and those two ideas have to be linked. And what I think we see today in 2022, that Menachem Begin probably would never have anticipated, was the extent of alienation of so many of our fellow Jews from Israel itself over time. You know, and this is the antidote. Let's celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut the right way. Let's build our identity as a people from the Exodus and as a religion from Mount Sinai. It's interesting that Yom HaAtzmaut fell between those two events. Let's affirm both. And then we'll be answering Mark Twain's old question, what is the secret of the Jews' immortality? And the answer is, this is the secret. And it transcends everything else.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
All right. Chag Sameach, Yom HaAtzmaut Sameach, and we should continue. We'll continue learning next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.